Thank you for that introduction, Keaton. I'm really excited to be giving this talk today, a little nervous. So without further ado, Musings of an Embarrassed Tween. When I was in the 9th grade, I fell in love with embarrassment. Now, I know what you're all thinking. 15 minutes of cringeworthy secondhand embarrassment as this teenager in front of hundreds of people is going to describe her most humiliating encounters. Now, while this is only partially true, I encourage you to hold on to your assumptions and hear me out. When I was 14 years old, I was an incredibly shy individual. I had severe social anxiety, and the much older and therefore much more mature juniors and seniors terrified me. Embarrassment was something I absolutely dreaded and would frankly do anything to combat. With that said, later in the year, I enrolled in a technical theater class where students would come together to build sets for musicals and theater productions and student productions, and it was an amazing experience. One day, I was nailing 2 pieces of wood together when I felt a shock roll through my body. I looked around and saw a friend of mine staring in complete awe. Before I knew it, the drama teacher was running around stage, and every student had dropped silent and was looking directly at me. Long story short, I had managed to nail my thumb rather than the 2 pieces of wood. This was by far the most embarrassing thing that had ever happened to me. I eventually went to the hospital and all was well, but when I returned to school, my tale was known by all. Students would flock to me asking, "Mansi, did you really get a nail in your thumb?" As if it was a fairy tale I had contrived. And on the other hand, students would come up to me saying, "How does someone even do that?" To which I frankly still don't have an answer. To make matters worse, only a few months later, I went to ISAS, an arts festival for independent schools around Texas. A day into the event, I was in a large setting and was accidentally pushed off a small ledge. Before I knew it, I had managed to bruise 4 ribs and break a finger. Again, this was all in the same year. Since my parents weren't there, I was escorted to the hospital by 2 teachers, one of which ironically was my technical theater teacher who had just experienced a nail gun fiasco only a few months back. But as you all know, good things come in 3, so this was not quite the end of my injurious year. Later in the school year, the entirety of the upper school was gathered outside the old high school theater in excitement for the last school performance of the improv troupe. Energy was high, and when the doors finally flung open, I, in my rush to grab a good seat, ran forward and saw a little too late 2 classmates of mine with their hands clasped together, declaring their love for one another. And as I got caught in the stampede, their hands clothespined me, and I started to fall back to the ground a little like this. Just as Mufasa hurled to the ground, so did I, and I saw these classmates of mine torn. Do we want good seats? Do we want a helper? Do we want good seats? Do we want a helper? And they went for the good seats. As I clasped my neck, trying to regain my breath, I saw everyone around me jeering, shouting, and laughing. Classic Mansi. So here I was, the burgeoning of my life, the first act of my existence, and I had already started out with a bang. I was mortified. Yet my newfound fame was not confined to just my fellow students. Faculty alike would approach me asking about the tall tales they had heard about the mysterious Mansi Kumar. And as I would elaborate on the nail gun, ISAS, the improv troupe story, and all the little fiascos in between, I was greeted with a colloquial and friendly, classic Mansi. My name had become an adjective and popular slang at Greenhill. Now, while it may sound strange, I had faced with 2 options. I could either sulk or I could embrace this. So if I was going to be known as injurious and clumsy, I would own it. Very soon, this shame turned into pride. I was accident-prone and proud. Before anyone could even ask me about one of my injuries, I had X-ray in hand ready to showcase. While my friend Elizabeth might have been boasting about her recent win at the National Spelling Bee, or Eric about his multiple recruitment offers for, say, college football, I was in a corner showing off a picture of a nail in my thumb. And while the unique ability of easily injuring oneself is not nearly on the same platform as, say, winning a National Spelling Bee, my point is I was able to use shame to build character. I grew more confident in myself. Conversations were not something to fear, but something to embrace. If an awkward silence came up, I would have a story to fill in the blank. My social anxiety shed. And, say, taking risks, they were not nearly as frightful because the worst that could happen was mild humiliation or going to a hospital. And frankly, I had experienced both of those on a much larger scale multiple times. With all this said, I want to delve a little deeper into embarrassment and hopefully convince you of its value. Now, scientifically, embarrassment actually holds a lot in common with failure. Scientists and psychologists describe embarrassment as, quote, an experience that alerts you of your failure to behave according to certain social standards, which threaten the beliefs you hold concerning how others evaluate you, as well as the ways in which you evaluate yourself, end quote. Upon embarrassment, your body will release adrenaline, which is a reason why a lot of people blush, and consequences include lower self-esteem, anxiety, less spontaneity, shame, and if you break it down even further, it is clear that the consequences and after effects of embarrassment are parallel, if not identical, to those of failure. To be succinct, I believe the two are synonymous. Yet why do we have such a different perception of embarrassment in contrast to failure? After years of stigma about failure, the general population is convinced of its silver lining. The enormous successes of influential figures such as J.K. Rowling, Steve Jobs, Einstein, and others have convinced the world of the ability to bounce back from something as disheartening as failure. If in fact this is true, then why can't the same be applied to embarrassment? If you analyze everything that successful people say, one thing that comes up is, failure is life's greatest teacher. The same can be applied to embarrassment. The base of embarrassment is shame. Shame makes you vulnerable. Shame makes you sensitive to your surroundings. Yet it can be utilized to cultivate character, just as failure can be used to generate future success. Now, the famous Robert Johnson is perhaps one of the most representative faces of blues music. But most people don't know that during his first performance, he bombed. Johnson had the opportunity to perform with his music idol, Son House, and when he got on stage, he just couldn't keep up with the rhythm and sounds, and he was booed off stage. He vowed to himself he never wanted to experience this sense of humiliation ever again in his life, and he practiced and practiced and practiced, and a year later, he came back to the same juke joint in front of the same music idol, Son House, and he performed his heart out, not multiple hearts. The audience was enamored with his distinct style and hardened vocals. He established himself as one of the front runners of blues music and is still held in high esteem today. Embarrassment for Johnson became a catalyst for him to improve his ability and range as an artist. But just think about it. You perform in front of your music idol, you're booed off stage. This is enough to persuade any artist that perhaps this lofty profession is not cut out for them. And what a travesty it would have been if the world had silenced Johnson's beautiful voice and we had never got to experience his sound due to something like mild humiliation. Now, the real fear with this sort of mindset is what I call the Larry effect. Some of you might be familiar with this, but for those of you who aren't, Larry is a character from the show Parks and Recreation who always embarrasses himself. He fumbles his words, he trips on tables, he says the wrong thing, spills food on himself, and in turn becomes the joke of his workplace. The fear seems to be, if I embarrass myself, I am more at risk for turning into some version of Larry in my own surroundings. Now, this is a very valid fear, but to dispel it, I'm going to outline some embarrassing occurrences that can happen to any of us and how they can be perceived as a positive rather than a negative. Number 1, bodily functions in a public setting. I'm sure some of y'all have already experienced this, but I have a short story to go along with this. Earlier this year, my friend Chastity started relating to me how in high school she had a huge crush on a boy in her grade, and every day they would go to the library and watch funny videos and things like that to bond and become better friends. One such day, she was watching a video, and in the dead silence of the library, she started laughing so incredibly hard that she began to flatulate. Chastity was mortified. This was the boy of her dreams, and he had seen her in her weakest moment. What was she going to do? She had two options. She could deny or she could accept, and frankly, if she denied, it would only lead to more speculation and laughter. She accepted it and tried to laugh it off, but a few minutes later, the boy just got up and left. Chastity said after this experience, she grew less self-conscious and started to care less about what others thought of her. And I'm happy to tell you that 4 months later, Chastity went on a date with the same boy. Scenario number 2, wardrobe malfunction. Now again, you have two options here. You can deny or accept, and frankly, the worst fashion mistakes end up being the hottest new trends. But if you do find yourself in this little conundrum, just look to this character from the movie Mean Girls. Again, deny or accept. You can cringe at your mistake or simply learn from it and move on. By now, you probably all see the ability to learn from embarrassment is to not deny its existence or try to forget that it ever happened, but to simply accept it for what it is, learn from it, and move on. And if after all this, you still end up falling prey to the Larry effect, I'm happy to tell you that Larry lives till he's 100 years old, has a beautiful wife, and is elected mayor of his town. So worse things could happen. Now that we're at this point of the talk, I want to say something. I'm not telling you that embarrassment is this amazing emotion, and after this you should all go flailing about trying to find ways to publicly humiliate yourself, but I am trying to point out the silver lining behind it. In my small case, embarrassment let me grow out of my shell. It helped me shed social anxiety and become more confident in myself, without which I would most likely not be giving this talk today. So, in my quest to learn more about embarrassment, I started asking those all around me about the most embarrassing experiences they had had and if they learned from it at all. I was shocked at how open people were at sharing their most intimate moments, and I wanted to share one story in particular that stood out to me. Rachel was in her early 20s when she went for a family reunion. Her family tends to be dramatic and overreact, so very soon into this event, tempers were high between herself and her cousin. Her cousin started listing out all her shortcomings, her flaws, the recent mistakes she had made, and Rachel was mortified in front of the people who were closest to her. After some time, she recuperated and reflected on what he had said, and realized, although not the time, place, or setting, there was some truth in what he had said, and in her case, embarrassment stripped her down. It left her bare between just herself and a mirror, and she had to take a hard look at herself and decide what she didn't like. She said after this experience, she corrected her bad habits and became the version of herself that she always aspired to be. Now, with all these stories and scenarios I pointed out today, to me there emerged 4 clear ways to deal with embarrassment. Number 1, don't shy away from center stage. As was my case, I showcased my small mishaps and grew from them. Number 2, motivation. As was Robert Johnson's case, embarrassment can be a powerful emotion and an even more powerful motivator to push you to excel and succeed at whatever it is you love. Number 3, never deny and always accept. You'll end up in a better place because of it. And number 4, reevaluate. Sometimes there can be truth in embarrassment, and you should never be blind to truth, especially if it can only help you grow. So I'll end with this. Next time you embarrass yourself, I urge you to lean into the discomfort. Utilize that emotion to help cultivate yourself. Don't let humiliation cloud you in shame, insecurity, or the thought for even a second that you are inferior. For it would be a loss for your friends, your community, and even the world if your voice or talent was silenced due to embarrassment, no matter how big or small. Thank you.